Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Devil in the Gallery, How Scandal, Shock and Rivalry Shaped the Art World, by Charney. Narrated by Julian. Publisher's Note. In this audio edition, you will hear references to visual elements present in the print and e-book formats of the book. Forward. Are artists a bit bizarre? Martin Kemp. Yes, was the answer given in the mid-16th century by Michele Savonarola, learned uncle of the turbulent priest Domenico Savonarola, who was to become a major agent in the violent overthrow of the Medici in Florence. In a similar vein, Federico Gonzaga, great patron of Andrea Mantegna in Mantua, warned the Duchess of Milan, "Typically, these excellent masters have something fantastic about them." The model of creative capriciousness they had in mind was derived from the poets of antiquity. Plato believed that poets created their verses when not in their right minds. This notion was taken up by Seneca, the Roman philosopher and playwright, who tells us that there has never been a great genius without some touch of madness. Shakespeare says much the same thing. The assigning of specific temperaments to individual painters and sculptors in the Renaissance went hand in hand with their increasing recognition as members of the creative elite, rather than craftsmen. Alongside this went greatly increased remuneration for practitioners with top reputations. What I have called the super artists, Mantegna, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael and Titian, needed to be humoured if a patron was to receive the finest fruits of their labours. Michelangelo's famed terribilità pushed to previously unthinkable limits his relationship with powerful patrons, not least with the equally terrible Pope Julius, patron of the Sistine ceiling. We thus have the four factors that drive the rise of uppity artists: the idea of artists as inspired creators, their upwardly mobile social status, their quest for fame, and their demands for high remuneration. However, and it is a big however, two of our grand super-artists were well-mannered and consummately professional in their dealings with patrons. For every jumped-up rogue, we can find one or more examples of exemplary gentlemen. The courtly Raphael and the ennobled Titian, the first pan-European star in the visual arts, are conspicuous cases in point. In the next century, the much-travelled Rubens indulged in artistic and political diplomacy at the highest international level. His greatest pupil, Anthony van Dyck, was described as living magnificently, more like a prince than a painter. The contrast with the belligerent and licentious Caravaggio could hardly be sharper. What is true is that the idea of the unruly artist provided a framework within which artists could sometimes get away with more than ordinary mortals. Benvenuto Cellini, virtuoso goldsmith and sculptor, owed his life in the face of his violent crimes, even more serious than those to which he confessed in his autobiography, to his merits as a great artist, and to the sense that wayward geniuses might be excused bad behaviour, as was Caravaggio to a degree. However, in the end Caravaggio's excesses caught up with him. The example of Cellini reminds us that violent artists do not necessarily produce violent art. Caravaggio's personality and art seem to match. However, Cellini's metalwork is sumptuously suave, and even his Perseus with the head of Medusa, a violent subject, is gracefully poised and stands on a stylishly decorative base as a rhetorical manifestation of art. Even if an artist were, for the most part, well-behaved and tractable, the quest for fame, as reflected in the rise of biography, could all too readily provide a source of bitter rivalry. The collision of Leonardo, Michelangelo and Raphael provides the first major public episode that is well documented. Though professional rivalries have always existed, like that between the Ghiberti and Brunelleschi during the construction of the dome of Florence Cathedral. Leonardo and Michelangelo notoriously disliked each other, most acidly when Michelangelo aggressively dismissed Leonardo's arguments that painting was superior to Michelangelo's beloved sculpture. Even the more diplomatic Raphael was drawn into rivalry with the difficult Michelangelo. When Giuliano de' Medici, Pope Leo X's brother, simultaneously commissioned altarpieces from Raphael and Sebastiano del Piombo, he was in effect setting up a competition between Raphael and Michelangelo, who had agreed to provide designs for the latter, his Venetian protégé. Letters between Sebastiano and Michelangelo in Florence document the bitterness. In one of the letters, Sebastiano wrote, "My more than father and most beloved, I am sorry that you were not at Rome to see 2 pictures by the prince of the synagogue, which have just been sent to France, for I believe that nothing more opposed to your views could be imagined. I need only say that the figures look as if they had been smoked or were made of polished iron, all bright and black." Given the nasty climate of anti-Semitism, Sebastiano's slur about the prince of the synagogue was about as unpleasant as it could be. The smoked style was a wholly unflattering allusion to Leonardo's influence on Raphael. Cellini's rivalries were at least as acid. His enmity with Baccio Bandinelli, the sculptor, was very bitter, as was his dislike of Giorgio Vasari, who had come to assume general dominance over artistic activities in the Florence of Grand Duke Cosimo I. The verbal picture of Little Giorgio in Cellini's autobiography, with his filthy claws, was viciously designed to undermine the stature and refinement to which the ambitious Vasari aspired. What we witness after the Renaissance is a steady progression of the idea that artists might well be expected to behave badly and even in a scandalous manner. Those who did so were more likely to be noticed and find their way into historical records than those who acted with propriety. Sin is generally more picturesque than virtue. There is also at least some sense that those artists who were temperamentally inclined to erratic relationships found some kind of encouragement from what was becoming the popular image of the artist. In the grand theatre of international art, artists could play up to their anticipated roles. The rise of the academies under noble or royal patronage, beginning with Vasari's Accademia delle Arti del Disegno in Florence in 1563, worked in the other direction, cultivating an aura of learning and the highest national and international values in the service of rulers. It would not be hard to accumulate plentiful stories of artists rising towards social respectability, assuming intellectual merit and acquiring material gains. But any resulting book would not have the appeal of this one, an anthology of antisocial activities. It is, paradoxically, the solid establishment of the academies that was to foster the context for rebellion. The stuffy complacency of the academies was a factor in their being progressively bypassed during the 19th century. The rise of new kinds of critics, patrons, dealers, and auction houses changed the environment for art. The traditionally great patrons of the church, the court, and aristocrats no longer held unrivaled primacy. The annual exhibitions of the academies played a role in this social revolution in the market for art. The rule of the academies was most dramatically challenged when Gustave Courbet set up his own pavilion of realism adjacent to the official art show during the Grand International Exhibition in Paris in 1855, a story likewise told in this book. A belligerent realist and socialist, Courbet knew how to shock with his art and political beliefs, and he clearly relished doing so. During the Paris Republican Commune in 1871, Courbet proposed that the huge Vendôme column, immortalizing Napoleon, be disassembled and moved to a less conspicuous location. In doing so, the whole column was brought crashing down ruinously. After the collapse of the Commune, Courbet was condemned to pay a massive sum for rebuilding the monument. He opted to go into self-imposed exile in Switzerland, and the French government sold off the artist's paintings cheaply. Courbet was to die in exile in 1877. Courbet's example of forthright independence from the standard institutions of art in the empire was vital for the younger generation. The Salon des Refusés and successive rebellions by groups of modern artists coming together as self-proclaimed revolutionaries stands in direct line of descent from Courbet's pavilion. We are witnessing a move from rebellion being rebellion to it becoming something of a standard stance in today's art world. To be involved in a bit of scandal is a good career move. Art institutions, including the academies, have come with slow and often ponderous agility to embrace rebellion and artistic scandals as a kind of norm in which artists become self-aware actors in what have become stereotyped dramas. The popular press plays its oddly duplicitous role, being shocked and relishing the process of being shocked. We are no longer surprised to be surprised, even if we are, sometimes, surprised by what the surprises are. Preface. Rivalry, scandal, and shock are negative things, aren't they? While in most fields they are, in the history of art they have actually been beneficial motivating factors for artists. Famous rivalries have helped elevate art to new levels. That Cimabue painted a Maestra led to his two-star pupils from rival cities, Duccio and Giotto, each painting the same subject, in direct competition with each other, and with their master, for who would paint it best. Bernini and Borromini vied for mastery of architecture in 17th century Rome, while an overt competition in Florence led to Brunelleschi coming up with a way to complete the world's largest dome when no other architect could. The animosity between Delacroix and Ingres, the Impressionists and the academics of late 19th century Paris, and countless other examples brim the edges of this book. The history of art is chock-a-block not only with fascinating and dramatic stories, but with rivalries that push the boundaries of what art could be and inspired genius to further heights. Scandals more often are the unmaking of individuals than the moment they establish themselves. But in the art world, scandal has almost always been a good thing for the artist and for their art. This has been so obviously the case that many artists have courted scandal intentionally, from Picasso's wave-making Guernica to Courbet's undermining expectations with his monumental paintings, to Whistler's that were deemed too hot for Victorian viewing. Linked with scandal is shock, the intentional overturning of expectations in order to be talked about. From Damien Hirst's Shark to Marcel Duchamp's Urinal, from body art involving letting one's own blood to statues of Christ immersed in urine, shock has been a key promotional tool. But shock in the art world is not only the realm of the 20th century. Caravaggio intentionally created works that he knew it would be deemed indecorous and rejected by the commissioners, for instance, when he used the corpse of a drowned prostitute that he'd seen fished out of the Tiber River as his model for the Virgin Mary in his Death of the Virgin. What would our history have looked like stripped of rivalry, in a world in which everyone got along and maintained the status quo? And what role does the public play as recipients of the stories, as the ones who are scandalized and the ones who are shocked? Over 3 distinct sections and covering more than 2,000 years of art, the case studies in this illustrated volume will look at when negatives resulted in positives and how dipping into the darkness and playing dirty upped the game of artists and benefited the course of art. Art is filled with individuals for whom rivalry, scandal and shock seemed integral parts of their DNA. Caravaggio and Bernini were rarely at peace and seemed to have been regularly asking for trouble, an attitude that ran parallel to the passion that stoked their artistic genius. The 3 categories frequently overlap in individuals and incidents. The Devil in the Gallery examines how these antagonistic actions, moods and tendencies, which we tend to think of as negative and destructive, actually help shape and elevate the course of art, where something beautiful grew out of the weeds and ruins of the drama. Introduction. Sympathy for the Devil. Caravaggio lived a violent, hot fist of a life. It was brief, full of angst, upset, blood and death, featuring a total revolution in painting on a scale only rarely approached in other periods in the history of art. Michelangelo Merisi, who got his nickname from having grown up in Caravaggio, near Milan, is one of just a handful of artists who completely changed art, shifted its continuum in a new direction. Along with the lights of Giotto, Masaccio, Donatello, Michelangelo, Turner, Picasso and Duchamp, Caravaggio was a game-changer, invoking a level of naturalism, drama, cinematic use of lighting, and surprising interpretation of religious scenes that turned the art world on its head. But while his art is, rightly so, the subject of reams of scholarly and popular writing, it sometimes slips between the cracks that Caravaggio was perhaps art history's most notorious criminal. He was a difficult character, someone who courted disaster, provoked it, and his life was a series of outbursts, incitements, scandals, rivalries, and shocks. But what if those very negatives were actually part of what made him great? The talent and genius were there, of course, but perhaps what we consider to be destructive in fact pushed his art to greater heights. We know far more about Caravaggio than most pre-modern artists because he was brought to trial so often. Court records have a habit of surviving far better than most, particularly in Italy's impressive archival system. So, while we do not even know the birth year of Hieronymus Bosch or what Rogier van der Weyden did for the first dozen or so years of his life, We can track Caravaggio's exploits in impressive detail, even to the day. He was also the subject of multiple biographies, including those written by people who knew him and sometimes hated him. These riches mean that we have a far more three-dimensional portrait of him, and it isn't pretty. In colloquial terms, Caravaggio was a major-league arsehole. He was also probably sociopathic, as so many people remark about his choleric, ill-tempered, jumpy, unpredictable personality, even those, like Cardinal del Monte, one of his earliest admirers and patrons, who wished him well. His roguish behaviour is attested to in the many pages of court documents from at least 11 different trials. He was a world-class bad tenant. He threatened his landlady, called her names, and pelted her with rotten vegetables and stones. He poked a hole in the apartment wall, ostensibly to let in natural light, but with it came snow, rain, and swarms of pigeons. He was almost certainly bisexual, involved in relationships with many women, most of them prostitutes. He probably also worked as a young male courtesan in the service of several cardinals who enjoyed such company. He would paint portraits of these consorts and of himself in a similar pose. He was likely in a physical relationship with one of his adolescent male models, Cecco de Caravaggio. His sexuality is not really relevant to the discussion of his criminal activities, other than to say that accusations of homosexuality and sodomy were cast around him, as both were illegal at the time. But it is often difficult to tell whether accusations were real or fabricated. To get someone into trouble in Baroque Rome, an enemy might accuse you of homosexuality, whether or not it was true. That he was a magnet for trouble, much of his own devising, is beyond doubt. He threatened to beat up painters who imitated his style. He did beat up a waiter, ostensibly for having served him a plate of overcooked artichokes. He had to flee Rome after having killed a rival in a fight and spent the remainder of his brief life travelling in hopes of a papal pardon for the murder. Both his pugnacious manner and the murder were impediments to his artistic career, as they forced him to lead so unsettled a life that his artistic production was limited due to his constant travel, always on the lam, getting on the wrong side of all who took him in. But other negative characteristics may have spurred his art forward. We tend to think of painters as perhaps somewhat effete, low-key types. But Baroque painters were a badass bunch. There were street gangs of painters, with a particular rivalry between Dutch painters living in Rome and local boys. Caravaggio was involved in gangs and gang street fights. He carried a sword, which was illegal at the time if you were not an aristocrat, and he had it inscribed with a decidedly badass phrase that translates as, "Without hope, without fear." It was likely a gang dust-up, coupled with affection for the same prostitute that led to his maiming, and the subsequent death of Ranuccio Tomassoni. It was recorded that the fight was over a tennis match, but scholars have found that it was not a straightforward murder, but rather a very personal attack. Tomassoni's genitals were mutilated, and he subsequently died from the wounds. Caravaggio was obliged to flee or face trial for murder, with the penalty capital punishment. He was under the protection of some powerful aristocratic patrons, including the Colonna and Del Monte families, but there was only so much they could do. In Rome, only the Pope, who was the equivalent of the king, had the power to pardon a murderer. And so Caravaggio fled, always hoping to return if a papal pardon could be secured. He first set off for the Colonna family estates outside of Rome. He continued on to Naples, where he scored major, lucrative commissions thanks to interventions by the Colonna family. Even while on the run for murder, Caravaggio was still the most popular avant-garde painter of the time, and his work was welcomed wherever he went. He might have remained in Naples, but his friend Fabrizio Sforza Colonna was about to set off for Malta. He was the general of the galleys of the Knights of Malta, a medieval crusader order, the Hospitallers, populated with members of Europe's finest families and with huge influence, particularly at the Vatican. Caravaggio saw membership in the order as his best chance for a pardon, so he joined Colonna and sailed for Malta. There he was immediately welcomed by Alof de Vignacourt, the Grand Master of the Knights of Malta, who was delighted that so famous an artist should rock up on the shores of his rocky island. While another knight, Malaspina, commissioned religious works, Caravaggio's St. Jerome and beheading of John the Baptist, Vignacourt had his portrait painted, as did some other illustrious knights. Things were looking good for Caravaggio, until, Caravaggio being Caravaggio, he got into trouble. The exact nature of it is not clear, but it seems that he got into a fight with another knight, an aristocrat to boot, in which he broke down a door and beat up his opponent. Having arrived in 1607, by mid-1608 he was cast out of the order, referred to as a putrid and fetid member, and thrown in prison. Alas, history does not record just how, but he managed to escape from prison and make his way to Sicily. When his winding path led him back to Naples in 1609, he was jumped by a gang of toughs who beat him so severely that he was permanently disfigured and died not long after, possibly from malaria, but just as possibly from the wounds inflicted. One theory suggests that the gang had been sent to kill him by order of the Vatican, in revenge for his fight with the knight on Malta. Violence and temper, therefore, were his enemies. But did he benefit from the rivalries, scandals and shock of his career that did not involve fists and blades? A close examination of how he chose to create art in a manner designed to shock leads to some surprising conclusions. He used as a model for the Virgin Mary in his Madonna of Loreto painting for the Church of Sant'Agostino in Rome, a prostitute friend of his named Maddalena Antonietti, nicknamed Lena, who liked to call herself La Donna di Caravaggio, Caravaggio's woman. Lena solicited clients on the street in front of the church of Sant'Agostino. This didn't go over so well when the locals walked past her on Sundays on their way to Mass, then saw her portrayed as the Madonna inside the church. Caravaggio could have chosen anyone as a model for his Virgin Mary, but instead he made the proactive decision to select someone whom the congregation would recognize as the polar opposite of a virgin. This was a volitional act, a sort of painted middle finger hanging over the altar inside his local church. His Death of the Virgin employed as the model for the body of Mary the corpse of a prostitute that Caravaggio saw dredged out of the Tiber River. He could have chosen anyone. His desire for naturalism made him select a corpse as the model for the deceased Virgin Mary, but that the corpse was of a prostitute, and that the finished painted figure still suggests a body that had soaked in dirty river water, was a proactive shock tactic. Some have theorized that he intentionally made works that church commissioners would find indecorous, not appearing as they had expected, and which they would reject. This meant that Caravaggio kept the advance on his commission, but then could quickly sell the finished, rejected painting to a private buyer for far more money than the church was offering. In this way, he financially benefited from intentionally creating edgy, indecorous works, effectively employing shock to his own end, for shock may be defined, for our purposes, as the intentional creation of a scandal through an action, in this case creating an artwork, that, by design, surprised and dismayed many. An example comes in his work for the Cesare Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo. He was commissioned to paint the crucifixion of St. Peter and the conversion of St. Paul. According to his first biographer, Giovanni Baglione, about whom more later, he painted versions of each that were rejected by the patron as indecorous. Both were then sold to private collectors, while he painted a second version of each, which were accepted and remained displayed in the chapel. To understand how Caravaggio could get away with defying, in an almost aggressive way, the expectations of his patrons, we must keep in mind just how popular he was and how recognized was his talent. After the appearance in 1599 of his St. Matthew cycle of 3 monumental paintings, his first large-scale public commission, Caravaggio was the toast of Rome, the most celebrated avant-garde artist in central Italy. The painting style that he essentially invented had no direct precedent. The revolutionary aspects were a strict break from the 2 leading schools at the time, one of which idolized Raphael's high Renaissance classicism, in which particularly biblical scenes were idealized, stripped of emotion, carefully posed, in balance, harmonious, calming compositions, and with a general overall diffused daylight, without shadows and with no obvious single light source within the painting. Raphael painted the happiest crucifixions one can imagine, for example, with no visible suffering, tableaux vivants that look more like models standing in poses than snapshots of real life. Each model's face likewise was idealized into a generically lovely visage, but not someone you would recognize if they walked past you on the street. The other preferred painting style at the time was mannerism, a movement launched by the followers of Raphael's great rival Michelangelo. This employed a similar general diffused lighting and idealized faces, but the painted bodies were intentionally contorted, extended, and twisted into anatomically incorrect, unnatural positions for dramatic effect. Caravaggio apprenticed in Rome to a B-level Mannerist painter, Cavaliere d'Arpino, for whom he largely painted still life elements in the background of paintings, flowers, baskets of fruit, architectural elements. Most artists throughout history studied under a master and continued or lightly varied that master's style. Not Caravaggio, who conceived of a radically new way of painting in terms of concept, basic technique and execution. Caravaggio did not use underdrawings, for instance, and he may not even have made preparatory sketches for his paintings, which was standard practice at the time, as none survive, whereas numerous examples do survive of other major artists. He would incise his canvases with the back end of his brush, pushing against it to make a general curve to delineate where he would paint his figures, but nothing like the normal method of carefully transferring preparatory drawings onto canvas or panel and building up by adding layers of paint to a drawing that would remain buried beneath the finished painting, and visible to modern conservators using infrared reflectography. To contemporary painters, this was like building a house without a set of blueprints. Conceptually, his works differed radically. He used models who were his friends and were known figures in the street life of circa 1600 Rome, usually from the fringes of society, jailers, soldiers, and male and female prostitutes. Artists regularly used models, but most at this time, except in the case of portraits, altered the faces of their models, idealizing them and shifting them away from recognizability and towards some platonic ideal of beauty. Caravaggio's models were painted as they appeared, often in all their haggard, ugly glory, which meant that viewers of the time recognized them, and many found it distasteful that these low-life characters were used as models for biblical protagonists, as in the models used for his Virgin Mary paintings. It was also shocking that Caravaggio painted biblical figures in contemporary clothing, rather than the early modern era of what people in Christ's time would have worn, togas and loincloths and the like. Yet Caravaggio was extremely religious and followed the recommendations of the Council of Trent, a series of emergency meetings of the Catholic Church to determine how to combat the Reformation to an extent that was beyond what commissioners expected. The Council encouraged a deeper meditative experience by imagining a biblical scene in the present day. This was why Caravaggio painted biblical figures in the attire of his contemporary Rome. But he was the first artist to take the Council of Trent's ideas on meditation and realize them in paintings, and it was upsetting for many viewers. His paintings also differ in terms of which moment in a biblical story he chose to depict. Raphael's and Michelangelo's works show a posed moment after an action is finished or before it has begun. Crucifixion paintings normally showed Christ on the cross after he had died. Caravaggio preferred a moment after an action has begun, but before it has ended. For example, his Crucifixion of St. Peter shows the saint alive, having just been fixed to the cross, while his executioners struggle to raise it upright. In his Calling of St. Matthew, part of the St. Matthew cycle that secured his renown, he shows Jesus pointing toward Matthew, but Matthew has not yet seen Jesus because he is in the midst of trying to steal money from his colleagues. In the Martyrdom of St. Matthew, from the same cycle, we see a moment after Matthew has been stabbed, but before he has died, with his murderers escaping and the slaves he was in the midst of baptizing, when he was attacked, reacting in horror and seeking to defend him. There is an extreme example in Judith and Holofernes, where he painted Judith severing the head of Holofernes, head half detached from his body, spurting blood every which way, but with Holofernes not quite dead yet. Unlike the high Renaissance posed scenes, Caravaggio's paintings are rich with movement, dynamism, and potential energy. If we imagine them as a paused screenshot from a film, were we to unpause them, lots of movement would follow. Blood spatters, baskets fall off tables, stools are knocked over, bodies tumble to the floor. Such was Caravaggio's popularity, his status as the talk of Rome, the artistic centre of Europe at the time, that artists and patrons inevitably lined up as for or against his revolutionary approach. There remained a classicist school of painters who still considered Raphael the greatest of all, and who continued his style with only gentle updates to keep with the times. This was most evident in the Carracci family, 3 Bolognese painters, Annibale, Agostino, and Ludovico, who founded an academy that trained the leading Italian painters of the mid-17th century, including Domenichino, Lanfranco, and Guido Reni. Their work is far more Raphaelesque, with only a limited aesthetic nod to Caravaggio through their paintings of darker scenes with more dramatic lighting and shadow play, chiaroscuro.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?